They say the dust has a memory. They say it holds the shape of every soul that has passed over it, every whispered prayer, every tear that fell and was swallowed before it could offer relief. In the forsaken territories where the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, the dust was a historian, a silent keeper of sorrows. And into this library of dust walked a man who was a story of grief all his own. His name was Silas, though no one in the town of Providence knew it. To them, he was just a silhouette, a tall, broad-shouldered shape that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He walked with a limp, a faint, rhythmic drag of his left foot that spoke of an old argument with violence, one he had not entirely won. His face, etched with lines that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he had witnessed, was a mask of stoicism. His eyes were the color of slate before a storm, holding a stillness that was more unsettling than any rage. He led a tired horse pulling a simple cart, its left wheel groaning with each rotation, a wounded creature crying out in the oppressive silence. He stopped before the meager collection of stalls that passed for a market, his gaze sweeping over the wilted vegetables and sun-bleached fabrics. It was then that the wheel, with a final, splintering crack, gave up its ghost, slumping the cart to one side with a puff of amber dust. Silas looked at it, his jaw tight, a flicker of something, not surprise, but weary resignation, in his eyes. His gaze settled on a stall at the very end of the row. A woman stood there, her hands busy mending a worn shirt, her movements deft and sure. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back tightly, revealing a face of proud, defiant beauty. Lines of worry were feathered around her eyes, but those eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She was Ilara. She sold small things, mended linens, polished stones, and a flock of tiny, intricately carved birds, each one a small, wooden prayer for flight. Silas approached her stall, his boots scuffing a soft protest from the ground. He dwarfed her small setup, a mountain of quiet sorrow casting a long shadow. Ilara didn't look up, not at first. She sensed him, the way a field mouse senses the hawk circling high above. When she finally lifted her head, her gaze was level, cautious. She saw the worn rifle case strapped to his cart, the raw-boned frame of his horse, the deep-set exhaustion in his face. He was trouble, of a kind she knew too well. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. He gestured with his chin toward the broken cart. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "The wheel," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a problem laid bare. Ilara looked from him to the shattered axle, her practiced eye assessing the damage. It was a difficult fix. It would require tools she barely had and strength she had to ration. "It's a bad break," she said, her tone flat. It was a warning. It was a test. He reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and produced a coin. It was silver, heavy and real, shining with an impossible brightness in the grimy air. He placed it on her small table, next to a carved wren. The coin was worth more than her entire store, more than the cart itself. It was a fortune. It was a trap. Ilara stared at the coin, then back at his face. Her heart, a tired, stubborn muscle, beat a little faster. She needed that money. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. But her pride was a fortress, its walls built from years of hardship. "That's too much," she said, her voice steady. He didn't move. His gaze didn't waver. "It's what I have." His words were clipped, final. He was a man who did not bargain. Ilara felt a current of fear, but something else, too. A flicker of curiosity. She saw the way his hand rested near the pistol at his hip, but she also saw the profound weariness in the set of his shoulders. He was a weapon, but a weapon that had been fired too many times. "I'll have change for you," she insisted, meeting his gaze. It was a foolish thing to say, a claim to a wealth she didn't possess, but it was a matter of principle. It was her way of saying she could not be bought. A long moment passed. The wind sent a tumbleweed skittering between them. Finally, a barely perceptible nod. He accepted her terms. She went to work. With a focus born of desperation, she gathered her tools, a rusted pry bar, a hammer with a chipped handle, a collection of salvaged nails and iron straps she kept in a wooden box. Silas watched her, his posture rigid, unmoving. He stood like a statue carved from granite and regret. When she struggled to lift the heavy axle into place, he stepped forward without a word, his large hands taking the weight with an ease that was startling. His fingers brushed against hers, and the contact was like a spark of lightning on the dry plain, brief, hot, and gone in an instant. She flinched, pulling her hand back. He didn't seem to notice. He held the beam steady while she hammered the braces into place, the rhythmic clang echoing in the dusty street. She worked through the afternoon, the sun searing the back of her neck. He never spoke. He just watched, his slate-grey eyes seeing more than the mended wood. He saw the tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on her brow that spoke not just of heat, but of a deep, consuming exhaustion. When the work was done, the wheel was solid, ugly but strong. She wiped her hands on her worn apron, a gesture of finality. She pushed a few copper pieces across the table toward him, her change of it was a pittance, a fiction, but it was hers. He looked at the coppers, then at her. He took them, his calloused fingers closing around the small coins. He packed his few belongings, his movements deliberate and slow. Ilara began to pack her own stall, relief and a lingering unease warring within her. The transaction was over. He would go. But as she turned to leave, her basket of unsold birds on her hip, she felt his eyes on her back. He hadn't left. He was watching her walk away, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the setting sun. An unfamiliar impulse, a knot of disquiet he couldn't name, tightened in Silas's gut. It was the coin. She hadn't even looked at it again. Her pride was a thing of fierce, desperate beauty, and it stood in stark contrast to the hollow hunger he'd seen in her eyes. He had to know why. As the shadows stretched long and thin, like grasping fingers, Silas turned his horse and followed, keeping his distance, his cart now rolling with a quiet, steady rhythm behind him. He followed her out of the dying town, onto the vast, empty canvas of the plains. The wind picked up, a mournful whisper that carried the scent of dust and distant rain. Ilara walked with her back straight, a solitary figure moving toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of itself. Her home, when she reached it, was barely a home at all. It was a sod house, dug into the earth as if trying to hide from the punishing sky. It was small and hunched, its roof patched with scavenged tin and tar, its single window a grimy, weeping eye. The place looked as if a strong gust might carry it away, scattering it like so much chaff. It was a testament to survival, not to life. As Silas drew closer, his horse stepping softly, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It wasn't the welcoming noise of a family at the end of a day. It was a thin, ragged sound, the dry, hacking cough of a small child. It was followed by another, weaker cough, and then a third. Overlapping them all was a sound that pierced the armor of his soul, the quiet, choked sound of a woman weeping. It was Ilara. Her sobs were not loud or theatrical, they were the hopeless, exhausted sobs of someone who had cried so much that no tears were left. He tethered his horse to a withered fence post and moved toward the cracked window, his limp forgotten. The dim light of a single tallow lamp flickered within, casting long, dancing shadows. He peered inside, and the scene that met his eyes knocked the air from his lungs. Ilara was kneeling on the hard-packed dirt floor. Around her, arranged like the petals of a dying flower, were 5 small pallets. On each pallet lay a child, their small faces pale and slick with the sheen of fever. They ranged in age from a boy of about 10 to a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 3. She moved between them, a frantic, desperate wraith, dipping a rag into a bucket of cloudy water and wiping their brows. Her movements were jerky, her body trembling with a grief too vast for her small frame. On a rough-hewn crate beside her, untouched, sat his silver coin. In a corner, a sack of flour was nearly empty, and a few withered potatoes lay in a basket. It wasn't just poverty. It was the dust fever. He knew it instantly. The pale skin, the rattling cough, the burning heat that radiated even from a distance. He had seen it before. A memory, sharp and brutal, sliced through him. Another room, much like this one. Another family. A promise he had made and failed to keep. A man's dying words, entrusting his wife and children to Silas's protection. A promise shattered by this very sickness, a sickness he had been too late to fight. The ghosts of that family were his constant companions, the silent passengers on his journey of atonement. He clutched the worn leather pouch at his belt. It was heavy with the herbs and roots he had gathered over years of wandering, sage to break a fever, willow bark for the pain, yarrow to staunch a wound. He carried it as a penance, a desperate hope that he might one day use it to balance the scales of his failure. He didn't knock. Announcing himself would only bring fear. He pushed open the flimsy plank door. It creaked on its leather hinges, the sound unnaturally loud in the sick room. Ilara spun around, her eyes wide with terror. Her hand shot out, grabbing a rusted fireplace poker, holding it before her like a sword. When she saw him, his tall frame filling the only exit, her face went slack with a new kind of fear. The stranger. The man from the market. Her mind raced. Had he come for the coin? For something more? Silas said nothing. His face was a mask, but his eyes, his storm-colored eyes, were fixed on the children. He looked past her, past the poker, his gaze cataloguing the severity of the sickness. He saw the faint blue tinge around the lips of the smallest child and knew there was no time for explanations, no time for fear. He stepped inside, his presence seeming to shrink the already cramped room. He walked past her as if she weren't there. He set his heavy rifle case down by the door with a quiet thud. Then he unfastened the leather pouch from his belt. He knelt on the floor, untying the leather thong. The scent of dried herbs, pungent and medicinal, filled the air, cutting through the stale smell of sickness. He didn't look at Ilara. He didn't ask her permission. He was no longer a stranger, he was a physician in a battle he refused to lose again. He began his work, his hands, which had looked so large and clumsy, moving with a practiced, gentle efficiency. He sorted the herbs, crushing leaves in a small stone bowl, his movements precise and economical. Ilara stood frozen, the poker still clutched in her hand. She watched him, her mind a whirlwind of terror and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He was a dangerous man, she had sensed it in the town. But here, in her home, he moved not with menace, but with a desperate, solemn purpose. For 2 days and 2 nights, they moved in a silent, exhausting orbit around the children. Silas prepared poultices and brewed bitter teas, forcing the liquids drop by drop between the children's cracked lips. He left only to hunt, returning with a brace of rabbits or a skinny prairie hen, which he cooked into a thin, nourishing broth. Ilara, her initial terror slowly receding, found herself falling into his rhythm. She held the children, soothed their fevered cries, and washed their small bodies. They did not speak. There were no words for the space they inhabited, a space of shared, desperate labor. They communicated in handed-off bowls, in weary glances across the dim room, in the shared language of a fight for life. On the 3rd morning, the fever of the eldest boy, Leo, broke. His skin, once fiery hot, was cool and damp. He opened his eyes and looked at the tall stranger beside him, not with fear but with a child's simple curiosity. One by one, over the next 2 days, the others followed. The last to recover was the little girl, Lyra. When her fever finally receded, and she breathed a deep, even sigh in her sleep, Ilara felt the tight knot of terror in her chest finally begin to loosen. She looked at Silas, who was slumped against the wall, asleep, his face in the lamplight looking younger, stripped of its harsh guard. A single tear, the first she had shed not from grief but from relief, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The fortress of her pride had been breached, not by force, but by an act of incomprehensible kindness. The sickness receded from the small house like a foul tide, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it felt like a part of the landscape. The silence that fell was different now. It was no longer the oppressive silence of fever and fear, but a soft, tentative quiet, pregnant with unspoken things. The children, pale and thin but on the mend, watched Silas with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He was a giant in their small world, a figure of myth who had appeared from the dust and banished the monster that had stolen their breath. The youngest, Lyra, whose life had hung by the most fragile of threads, became his shadow. She would sit near him as he oiled the worn stock of his rifle or sharpened his knife, her large, solemn eyes following his every move. One afternoon, while sitting outside the door, Silas took a small block of pine from his pocket and began to whittle. His large, scarred hands moved with surprising delicacy. Slowly, a shape emerged from the wood, a bird, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening. It was just like the ones her mother carved to sell. He sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and held it out to Lyra. She hesitated for a moment, then her small fingers closed around the wooden offering. A shy, watery smile touched her lips. She scurried back to her mother, holding the bird up for her to see. Ilara watched the exchange from the doorway, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. It was gratitude, sharp and overwhelming, but it was tangled with something more. This man, this wanderer with ghosts in his eyes, had shown her children a tenderness she had forgotten was possible. The gesture of the carved bird was a bridge, and she found herself willing to cross it. That evening, she made a stew from the last of the rabbit he had caught and the few remaining potatoes. It was thin, but it was hot. She ladled it into 2 bowls and set one down in front of him where he sat by the fire. It was the first meal they had shared that was not a necessity of their vigil, but an offering. A communion. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He looked up from the fire, the flames dancing in his slate-colored eyes. He simply nodded, accepting her thanks as he had accepted the stew. They ate in silence, but the space between them felt charged. The quiet was no longer empty. He began to fix things. The leaking roof was patched, the broken door hinge was reinforced with a strip of leather, the wobbly leg of the table was secured. He worked without being asked, his movements economical and purposeful. He was nesting, making the fragile shelter stronger, more defensible. Ilara, in turn, found herself tending to him. She saw a long, ragged tear in the shoulder of his canvas shirt, a relic of some past struggle. One evening, while he was outside checking the snares he had set, she took it and mended it with neat, strong stitches, her needle and thread moving with a familiar rhythm. She left it folded on his bedroll. He never mentioned it, but the next morning he wore it, and she saw him run his fingers over the mended seam. The questions about him burned in her mind. Who was he? What violence had put that limp in his step and that sorrow in his gaze? One night, as the children slept soundly for the first time in weeks, she found him outside, cleaning his rifle under the cold, indifferent light of the moon. The weapon was a part of him, an extension of his will. It was meticulously maintained, the tool of a man whose life depended on it. She stood in the doorway, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. "Who are you running from, Silas?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The question hung in the air, audacious and direct. He stopped his work, his hands going still on the oiled steel. He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. He didn't turn to look at her. His gaze was fixed on the far, dark horizon. "Not running," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. Hunting, the word sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The next day, the world seemed to hold its breath. A rider appeared on the horizon, a lone, dark speck against the pale sky. The figure sat on his horse for a long time, simply watching the sod house, before turning and disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze. It was a premonition. The wind shifted, turning colder, carrying a scent of something other than dust. Silas changed. The quiet competence was still there, but now it was sharpened by a new edge of vigilance. His hand rarely strayed from the worn pistol tucked into his belt. His gaze constantly swept the horizon. He began to teach Leo, her eldest, how to read the land. Not just how to set snares for rabbits, but how to notice a broken twig, a disturbed patch of earth, the unnatural silence of birds, the signs that someone had passed where they shouldn't have. He was teaching the boy to see threats. That night, he finally told her. Not everything, but enough. He sat across from her at the small table, the lamp casting his face in stark relief, making the lines of grief seem deeper. He spoke of a man named Tobias Thorn. A man who dealt in human lives as other men dealt in cattle. Thorn ran a settlement in the Northern Territories, a place that promised work and safety but delivered only bondage and despair. I worked for him, Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. They called me his shepherd. My job was to bring back the ones who ran. Ilara listened, her hands clenched in her lap. She pictured him, this quiet, gentle man, as a hunter of people. I took his coin, Silas continued, his eyes focused on something far away, something only he could see. Until he sent me after a family. A farmer, his wife, their 2 sons. They ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I tracked them for 3 days. When I found them, the fever had found them first. I was too late. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Now she understood. The ghosts he carried had names. I left, he said. But I took something. A ledger. His ledger. It has the names, the dates, the payments for every person he ever bought or sold. Proof of his crimes. He looked at her then, and his eyes were raw. He's not hunting me because I ran. He's hunting me for this. He gestured with his chin toward the cart outside. It's in a false bottom beneath the floorboards. He doesn't just want it back. He wants me buried with its secrets. The pieces clicked into place. The rider on the horizon. The lessons for Leo. The constant, humming tension that had settled over him. Tobias Thorn was coming. And he was bringing hell with him. The sky began to bleed. The setting sun painted the clouds in violent streaks of bruised purple and angry orange. The world fell silent. The chirping of the crickets ceased, the wind died down, and an unnatural stillness settled over the plains, as if the very land was holding its breath. They came not as a single rider, but as a group of 5, dark shapes materializing from the twilight. They rode with the easy confidence of predators who knew their prey was cornered. At their lead was a man on a fine black horse, his posture erect, his clothes clean despite the dust of the trail. This had to be Tobias Thorn. They fanned out, surrounding the small sod house, their rifles held loosely but ready. They were not lawmen. They were wolves. Thorn reined in his horse 100 feet from the door and dismounted. He moved with a chilling, unhurried grace. He took off his leather gloves, slapping them against his thigh. Silas, he called out. His voice was not a rough shout, but a cultured, resonant baritone that carried easily in the still air. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command, a voice that could soothe or condemn with equal ease. My shepherd. I know you're in there. I've come for what is mine. Inside the house, the air was thick enough to choke on. Ilara stood by the single window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter Silas had fashioned. She saw the men, the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel, the cold arrogance of the man in the lead. Her children were huddled in the far corner, Leo trying to look brave for the others, his small face pale and tight. Lyra clutched the wooden bird Silas had carved for her, her knuckles white. Ilara's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a slow, hot anger began to burn. This was her home. These were her children. He's a patient man, Silas said, his voice low. He was checking the action on his pistol, his movements fluid and certain. He will try to break me before he tries to break the doors. As if on cue, Thorn's voice called out again, laced with a cruel amusement. I hear you've taken up with another family, Silas. A widow and her brood. You always did have a weakness for strays. Let's hope this one fares better than the last. The words were aimed like a poisoned dart, designed to find the wound of Silas's failure and twist. Silas flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He closed his eyes for a second, the ghosts of the past swirling around him. Ilara saw it. She crossed the room and stood before him. She placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid, coiled like a spring. She looked into his tormented eyes. You are not that man anymore, she said, her voice a fierce, steady whisper. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. You are not his shepherd. You are Silas. He looked at her, truly looked at her. In her gaze, he found not the judgment he carried within himself, but a defiant, unwavering faith. It was the absolution he had never believed he would find. The ghost receded, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. This was not about his past anymore. It was about her future. Their future. There's a root cellar, he said, his voice urgent and low. Under the floorboards in the corner. I widened the tunnel when I was fixing the foundation. It comes out in the rocks 50 yards to the west. Take the children. Take them and do not look back. And you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Thorn came for me, he said. And for his ledger. He'll get one of them. It was a desperate plan, but it was their only one. Ilara gathered the children, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kissed each of them, her movement swift and silent. Leo, you are in charge. You keep them quiet, you keep them moving. Do you understand? The boy nodded, his eyes wide but determined. She guided them to the loose floorboards, helping them down into the dark, earthy-smelling tunnel. Before she followed, she turned back to Silas. He was standing by the door, his rifle in one hand, his pistol in the other. He looked like a vengeful god from an old story. Their eyes met across the dim room, and in that single look, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. He gave her a sharp, curt nod. Go. She slipped into the darkness, pulling the floorboards back into place. Thorn's voice called out one last time. Your hour is up, shepherd. Send out the book, or I'll burn this hovel to the ground with everyone in it. The door creaked open. Silas stepped out into the moonlight. He was alone. In his left hand, he held a thick, leather-bound book, the ledger. He held it up for Thorn to see. He began to walk forward, his limp pronounced, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. He was the very picture of a broken man surrendering. Thorn smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gloom. It was a predator's smile, full of triumph and contempt. I knew you'd see reason, he said, taking a step forward. Silas continued his slow, shambling walk toward the fire Thorn's men had built. He drew closer and closer. Then, in one swift, explosive movement, his entire posture changed. The slump was gone, his body uncoiling with lethal grace. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled the ledger not at Thorn, but directly into the heart of the roaring bonfire. No! Thorn screamed, his composure shattering. As his men lurched instinctively toward the flames to retrieve the book, the night erupted. Silas's pistol was in his hand, barking once, twice. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of powder, the shouts of men. He moved with a brutal economy, using the flickering firelight and deep shadows as his allies. He was not a brawler, he was a tactician. He dropped behind the water trough, firing, moving, never presenting a stationary target. A bullet tore through the flesh of his left arm, but he barely registered the pain. From the rocky outcrop to the west, another shot rang out, sharp and distinct from the others. One of Thorn's men, who had Silas pinned down, cried out and crumpled to the ground. Silas risked a glance. He saw her, Ilara, braced against a boulder, her old hunting rifle pressed to her shoulder, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She was not hiding. She was fighting. For her home. For her children. For him. A renewed strength surged through him. He was no longer fighting alone. The battle was short and savage. Silas, with Ilara's covering fire, moved through the remaining men with a chilling efficiency. Finally, only Thorn was left. He stood, his fine coat spattered with dirt, his face pale with fury and disbelief, his pistol aimed at Silas. But Silas was faster. His shot was true. Thorn staggered back, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust his empire was built on. The silence that fell was more profound than before, broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire as it consumed the last of Tobias Thorn's secrets. The fire ate the ledger, page by page, turning names and numbers, a history of human misery, into blackash that floated up into the uncaring night sky. The plains were still once more. The battle was over. Silas stood in the sudden, ringing silence, his pistol still warm in his hand. The adrenaline began to fade, and a searing pain bloomed in his left arm, a hot, wet feeling spreading down his sleeve. He swayed, leaning heavily against the side of his cart, the world tilting at a dangerous angle. He heard the crunch of boots on the dry ground and looked up. Ilara was running toward him, her rifle clutched in one hand, her face stark and pale in the moonlight. She reached him, and her eyes went immediately to the blood soaking his shirt. "You're hurt," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly. Without hesitation, she ripped a long strip of cloth from the hem of her dress. Her touch, as she wrapped the makeshift bandage around his arm, was firm and sure. The fear was gone from her face, replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness. This time, there were no barriers between them. The secrets had been burned away, the ghosts of his past vanquished not by his solitary vengeance, but by their shared fight. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. He looked past her, toward the still form of Tobias Thorne. "He can't hurt anyone else, no," she replied, her hand coming to rest on his chest, right over his heart. "He can't." She could feel the steady, strong beat beneath her palm. It was the most reassuring sound in the world. They stood there for a long moment, anchored to each other in the quiet devastation. The children emerged from the rocks, hesitant at first, then running toward their mother, their small forms clinging to her. Leo looked at Silas, his young face a mixture of awe and concern. "Did you win?" he asked. Silas looked at Ilara, at the children gathered around her, at the small, defiant sod house that had become a sanctuary. "Yes," he said, and the word held a meaning deeper than victory in a gunfight. "We won." In the days that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the small homestead. It was not the tense quiet of waiting, but the deep, restful calm of a storm that has passed. Silas's arm began to heal, the pain dulling to a persistent ache. Ilara tended to it daily, cleaning the wound and changing the dressing, her movements gentle and familiar. The children, their fear forgotten, no longer treated him as a mysterious guest. He was a fixture, a permanent part of their landscape. Leah would proudly show him the snares he had set, asking for advice. The younger ones would trail after him as he worked, their chatter a constant, cheerful hum. Lyra, the quietest of them all, took to leaving him small gifts where he would find them, a smooth, grey stone, a strangely shaped twig, and on one occasion, her own treasured wooden bird, placed carefully on his bedroll while he slept. The gesture tightened his throat. His quest was finished. The ledger was destroyed, Thorne was gone. There was nothing keeping him here. He was free to go, to ride away into the horizon and resume the solitary life he had always known. The thought, which once would have represented freedom, now felt like an exile. He found he had no desire to leave. The open road no longer called to him. It was the small, patched-up sod house that held him now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the plains in a soft, golden light, he saw Ilara in the small patch of land beside the house. She was on her knees, turning the hard, dry soil with a spade, preparing it for a garden. Her movements were strong and rhythmic, full of a stubborn, relentless hope. He walked over and stood beside her, watching her work. The rich, earthy smell rose to meet him. He could leave. He could mount his horse and be gone by morning. The words to say goodbye formed in his mind, but they felt like lies. They caught in his throat. Ilara didn't look up, but she knew he was there. She knew the question that hung unspoken in the air between them. "The soil is poor here," she said, her voice soft. She plunged the spade into the earth again. "It's hard ground. Takes a long, long time for anything to take root." Silas bent down, his good hand scooping up a handful of the dark, crumbly earth. He let it run through his fingers, feeling its texture, its potential. He looked from the soil in his hand to the woman kneeling before him, her face full of a strength and grace that humbled him. "I'm good at waiting," he said. His voice was steady. It was the truest thing he had ever said. He walked to the door of the sod house. On a wooden post beside it, he hung his battered hat. The hat had been his shield, a symbol of his wandering, of the man he used to be. Leaving it there was a surrender. It was an anchor. It was a promise. Ilara stopped her work and watched him. As he turned back toward her, his face was stripped of its old shadows, his slate-gray eyes clear. And for the first time since he had arrived in a cloud of dust and grief, a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. She answered with her own, a brilliant, beautiful smile that lit up her entire face, chasing away the last of the weariness from her eyes. The storyteller's voice might say that this is how legends are born. Not always in the thunder of battle, but in the quiet moments that follow. It might speak of how even in the most barren soil, with enough patience and courage, something beautiful can grow. A man haunted by the promises he had broken found a new one to keep. A woman who fought to protect her family found that her family had grown. They had found a home, not in a place on a map, but in the small, sacred space they had built between them, a shelter against the dust and the sorrows of the world. The hat on the post was a silent testament, catching the last rays of the setting sun, a journey's end, and a new life's beginning.